Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon.
Something happened, I think, in the 4th or 5th semester, which is that I started sensing an acute resistance in the campus for certain points of view. And this was not just limited to my college campus, but a couple of other places as well. And to the extent that this particular point of view, which I strongly believe in, or let's say the worldview that I believe in, was stifled and suffocated in a lot of places. So I wanted to understand if there is a way that I could actually contribute to changing the narrative, or at least to open up the discourse to a bit more. So, and that's when I started thinking of options outside of engineering. Coming from a lower middle class family, I did not have too much of exposure outside the engineering background at all. So the idea was to explore possible career options either in the bureaucracy and civil services or in law. And so I zeroed in on the law for the simple reason that I think my skill sets, or at least my basic constitution, so to speak, was more suited for the law. And that's why I made the transition. And fortunately, since in 2006, IIT Kharagpur was introducing a program, which was an LLB with a specialization in intellectual property rights, exclusively catering to people with a science background in one way or the other. I wanted to explore the program, and I realized that I could continue to have some kind of a tenuous connection with tech. Although I must confess that it's been over 13 years and I don't think I've gone back to being an engineer, except for the limited purposes of making an argument on an IP matter or a patent matter. So that's the reason. So largely the profession fascinated me, it attracted me, and its approach to logic, reason, and the fact that it had more grey than, let's say, a binary approach was something that I was certainly drawn to, and hence the choice.
Right. And you initially worked with Sai Krishna and Associates, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, so I started my career with Sai Krishna and Associates in July 2009. I think it was on the 14th of July 2009 when I set foot in the profession. 2015 Feb March is when I was made an associate partner, and in 2016 June I quit to go independent as an arguing counsel, because I had already developed a reputation as someone who could argue without being led by a senior by then. By God's grace, I think 2 or 3 things happened, which is one, people who I had argued against when I was part of the firm decided for their own reasons to engage me in their matters. So for all practical purposes, my erstwhile opposing counsels became my briefing and soliciting counsels. So that was one thing. Second, at least a handful of entities showed confidence in me to support me during the initial days of my practice by giving me retainers, thanks to the fact that I had at least a relationship for over half a decade with each of those entities. And in this profession, I think by and large, it's the word of mouth that counts, not just handing out cards. That's my limited experience, of course. So I think they were kind enough to put in a good word about me to other people. And more than anything else, when people see you in action, that is the only thing that can convince them whether or not you're worth the money and their time and attention. So I think gradually, brick by brick, it went off. I must say that by God's grace, it was not a struggle, but every nascent entity, no matter how small or big, has its own teething issues in terms of logistics and setup, and ensuring that you have juniors and ensuring that you have enough liquidity to fund your juniors and keep them happy, and also give them quality work. Because at the end of the day, why should people come and join someone who's barely 32 and who has set a practice as an arguing counsel? There's no reason at all. So some of my juniors were kind enough to take massive pay cuts. They were working in fairly decent law firms, at least mid and big level law firms, big size law firms, and they decided to work with me. And at least 2 of them have stuck on, and others have been kind enough to pass on a good word even after they left. So it's been rewarding over the last, I think from 2016 to 20, it's close to 4 years now. So the experience has been good.
Right. And as someone who's walked the path, what advice would you have for someone who wants to shift across from a different discipline into law, and what are the sort of the pitfalls you need to avoid?
One, I think if an engineer can end up doing management and then sit in a bank, I don't see why is it that they can't take up law.
Right.
But having said that, this is a profession that requires a different set of skills, and it requires contrary to popular perception, more lateral thinking, and the ability to slog and the ability to be patient, because you enter the profession with a lot of role models in your head and a lot of dreams and whatnot, but the pace of the profession in the initial few years is bound to be slow. So over 50% of the people who, at least, and when I mean profession, I mean litigation, of course. I can't speak of any other model of practice because I have no experience in that at all. So I can't speak from the standpoint of a transactional lawyer because I've never been one. So in terms of litigation, I think what's important is acumen, intelligence, and erudition is perhaps 60 to 70%, but the critical 30% is fortitude, perseverance, persistence, and patience, because it takes time for people to notice you, and you have to wait. And you have to wait for, as someone said, for your time to come. So until then, you have to keep slogging it out. But what you must ensure in the meantime is that when the opportunity presents itself, you're not found wanting in terms of preparation and, let's say, ability. So all that each day must be spent at least preparing for the big break. And usually it's not one big break, it's multiple small breaks and medium-sized breaks, which translate to something. And you never know where you're in the profession. Somebody else will come and tell you that this is where you're in the profession. So that's one of the things. So that clearly shows that someone's always watching you. That cuts both ways. And since it's a public sport, you might as well prepare to the best of your abilities and ensure that each day in court counts. You make it count. Who knows what kind of a procedural issue could translate to a legal precedent. So that's the training, and that's always been my approach. And since I was not pushed into the profession and I chose this particular profession, I decided to latch onto it like a new convert, so to speak. And I did my Sashtang Namaskar to the profession, so to speak. So that's where it is. So it is without a doubt one of the biggest breaks I've had, and perhaps the biggest break I've had so far. There's no doubting it at all. So this is what happened. In 2016, I had already gone independent by June, and around that period, I think this organization called the People for Dharma was looking for someone to represent them, and it was led by two brilliant ladies, Miss Shilpa Nair and Miss Anjali George, both of whom are fervent devotees of Ayyappa, Lord Ayyappa, and they were looking for somebody to represent them, and both of them have a fairly strong presence on Twitter. So someone ended up recommending me, saying that perhaps I bring what, according to him or her, was bang for the buck. And considering the nature of the matter, I would have anyway appeared pro bono, which has been the case all along. So somebody recommended, and then we got in touch. So the counsel on record, the advocate on record, Mr. Suvidat Sundaram, reached out, and then they said, they asked me if I would be interested. I said, why not? Sure, absolutely. So this was in 2016. By which time the matter had picked up steam, which is to say that the three-judge bench then, Justice Deepak Mishra, Justice Bhanumati, and Justice Ashok Bhushan, they had started hearing this to ask themselves whether there is a case made out for a reference to a constitutional bench. So this had already started. So that was around the time that I got into the matter, and when the matter was argued, I think on the 20th of February 2017 before the three-judge bench, I got to present the case on behalf of People for Dharma then. That's when all the intervention applications had been allowed, and then the matter was referred by judgment of 13th of October 2017 to the Constitutional Bench. So that's how the entire opportunity came about, and which is why I said it's a case of sheer luck. Somebody thinking that you are capable of handling a certain matter, so clearly someone was paying attention. So it reinforced my notion that if you assume that nobody notices what you do, whether it's good or bad, there is always somebody noticing you, somebody watching. So that paid off. And of course, the Constitutional Bench was a different story altogether. So the Constitutional Bench, I wasn't sure I'd get an opportunity, because obviously who's going to give a 30-year-old an opportunity before the Constitutional Bench, and that too a matter of this nature. And that too we had some fantastic seniors. Mr. K. Parasran was there. How do I put it? So I think there were three back-to-back matters that were going on. Yeah. I think there was the 377 case, yeah, and then of course there was the adultery hearing as well. And then you had these hearings, or maybe it was the other way around. But the 377 hearings were certainly held before the Sabarimala case. Yeah. And I think on the 17th of July 2018 is when the arguments commenced. And so we were patiently observing the bench in the previous matters as well, and then we spilled over into this matter as well. And we were just waiting because honestly, as I said, I wasn't sure that I'd get an opportunity. I got exactly about 4.5 to 5 minutes before the 3-judge bench in 2017 Feb. And I was hoping that even if I get about 15-20 minutes, I'll quickly make my points and then the rest I'll capture in my written submissions, which I think is mostly the procedure that's followed even in the US Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Oral submissions are kept to a certain limit and then the rest is captured in the written submissions and the briefs. So I had prepared accordingly, but to say that I had prepared accordingly would be, I think, a misstatement. I had tremendous support from a lot of researchers. People who've been working on this particular case and who had been working on it for a very long time, who were absolutely clear about the practice, the scripture where it could be traced to, the broader school of practice that it could be located within. And the interesting part is they were fantastic when it comes to their knowledge of constitution and interface with religion as well. So I think it's important to name them. Sri T.R. Ramesh, Sri Ravilochanan Iyengar, his brother Arvindalochanan Iyengar, Anjali George herself. I think even we had help from Mr. Arvind Subramaniam and a lot of other people. These are all people with no legal training, so to speak, but people who understood how the law works when it comes to religion and who've been working on these matters for a very long time, including temple freedom issues. Then of course my researchers, then Shaktiki Sharma, then my own colleague Avinash, and then my former colleague Ashutosh, who was my right-hand man, so to speak, during this matter, who assisted me during the course of the entire thing. Mr. Ishan Ghosh, who was a product of National Law School, Bangalore. So each of these people chipped in. So we were ready and we were just wondering, would we get a chance? And I think around the third or the fourth day of the hearing is when Justice Deepak Mishra effectively pointed out, I think on the 24th of July is when he pointed out to our side, effectively saying that by the 26th of July, before the lunch session, we would have to close our turn of arguments, and then it would then go back to the writ petitioners for the rejoinder submissions, because we were the respondents, so to speak. So on that day, I had made a request that since I was representing women and the petitioners were women, it is important to hear the point of view of the women who support the traditions of the temple. So I made a request for 5 minutes. So he said, okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. So on the 26th, I think before me, 2 senior counsels argued. One was Mr. Sri V. Giri, who represents the chief Tantri of the Sabarimala temple, followed by Mr. K. Radhakrishnan, who was then the counsel for the Pandalam royal family. And by the time both these senior counsels were done, it was 12:54. So I had exactly 6 minutes to wrap up my submissions. So at 12:54, I just jumped up and I said, you promised me 5 minutes, so kindly give me just 5 minutes. So he said, okay, why don't you start? So I just immediately rushed to the podium and I basically said that women on the other side have argued for their rights and the women on this side have their own rights, but there is one right that the court has not considered, which is the right of the deity itself. So I think somewhere that clicked, or at least it got their attention. Yeah. And then I think Justice Nariman and Justice Mishra conferred and they decided to give me 20 minutes post-lunch. So I assumed that I'd put my foot in the door. So I said I was hoping for 15 minutes, I was getting 20 minutes, I've already spoken for 5 minutes, so it's 25 minutes, that's a bonus. Yeah. So I decided to again put it in as concise a fashion as possible. But as my submissions went on, questions came and then answers started and then it went on. So it was like a serve and volley game. Yes. So once that started, by the time I was done, it was about 3:45, 3:50 that evening. So even I wasn't sure. And in fact, at the end of that particular submission, the bench was kind enough to ask. In fact, Justice Nariman was kind enough to ask me, would you want to submit more? So at which stage I had to say that I have nothing left. I've exhausted all the ammunition that I had with me and I have nothing more to submit. There I must also give credit to all the other senior counsels and other counsels whose turn had yet not come and who were kind enough to give their share of time to me as well, to say, you please continue because you seem to have the ear of the bench, so just continue with it. Yeah. So this is never a solo act. This profession, contrary to popular perception, even if you practice as an arguing counsel, is never a solo act. You need the goodwill, the blessings, the well wishes of a lot of people. That's how it works. So ultimately, by the time I was done, I just wasn't sure what had exactly happened. And I couldn't recall my own arguments because it seemed like I was in a trance. So by the time I was done, I just sat down. So one of my very good friends, Ms. Anandita Mitra, who was not exactly a person who doesn't support my position on the case, but was a very dear friend, was someone who was extremely appreciative and who just wanted me to explain how I felt about the entire arguments. I said, I honestly don't know. All I want to do is just go and sit in a temple at this stage. That's all I can say. So that's what happened. And I don't think the experience of arguing before the bench in this matter actually sunk for the next 2 days. It was only 2 days later then I realized that something of this nature had exactly happened. But be that as it may, I think credit must go to the bench and for the Supreme Court for busting a few stereotypes, which is that the assumption is that junior counsels don't get too much of a shot in a matter of this nature and the stakes before a constitutional bench. I think the bench was kind enough to do that. And then I subsequently got to argue before the review bench as well. That was before Justice Ranjan Gogoi. Anybody who's been associated with the matter and who actually knows what the prayers are in the original writ petition, which was 373 of 2006, would disagree with this particular position for a good reason. And I'll just give a couple of points which anybody can Google up and look at. So just take a look at the order of another judgment of 13th of October 2017, where the 3-judge bench had referred the matter to the Constitution bench, where the court has captured, I think, and extracted the 2 prayers of the writ petition. The first prayer is specific to Sabarimala. The second is beyond Sabarimala and speaks of places of worship across the country regardless of faith.
Right.
Okay, so that was already there. Unfortunately, during the course of the proceedings before the Constitution bench, the focus was entirely about Sabarimala. Because frankly, the court did not deem it fit to consider the impact of its decision outside of Sabarimala. Because had it done so, I think it would have been imperative to hear voices from other traditions as well and other faiths as well. Unfortunately, that never happened. So this was one of the things that we pointed out during the course of the review. But the most important thing that we pointed out were certain patent errors according to us. So while it is believed, and everybody is entitled to their own opinion, which is to say that there were no patent errors, we believe that there were patent errors both with respect to law and facts. So for instance, one of the things that I think is fairly public, which is in para 122 of Justice Deepak Misra's opinion, which was authored on behalf of Justice Khanwilkar as well. His Lordship had actually taken the position that no scriptural or textual evidence had been placed to support the practice, when in fact we were the ones to actually place that. So we cited all of that, and of course a couple of other legal positions as well. So one, according to us, a case of review within the 4 confines, or let's say within the 4 corners of Article 137, Rule 137 is very clearly made out. And most importantly, I think the review bench also realized that some of the questions that we had raised would have an implication not just in Sabarimala, but the other pending petitions as well, with respect to entry of Parsi women into the Akyari, entry of Muslim women into dargahs and mosques, and FGM. Or let's call it female circumcision as opposed to female genital mutilation. So these issues as well, it would have a bearing. To some extent, if not entirely, because each case has to be decided on its own facts and cases, and there's no comparison between each of these cases in entirety. So I think the bench was very cognizant of that. So if you read paragraphs 3 to 5 of the review order of the 14th of November 2019, I think Justice Ranjan Gogoi, it was a 3-2 decision, so to speak. So Justice Gogoi, Justice Khanwilkar and Justice Indu Malhotra were ad idem that it raises certain questions which clearly requires an application of mind by a larger bench, particularly in light of a perceived conflict between Shirur Math, 1954, and I think the Dawoodi Bohra case, the Dargah Committee case, sorry. So these were the 2 decisions which the court had decided to focus on, to establish that the issues present or warrant a larger bench, or review by a larger bench, or application of mind by a larger bench, coupled with these 2 judgments as well. So, in my opinion, despite being, let's say, an interested party in the outcome, so to speak, I believe that it is squarely within the scope of nature of a review, because I think I've had an opportunity to read the review petitions filed by other parties as well. So we filed it on behalf of the 3 entities that we represented, People for Dharma, Pandalam family by then, and Chetna as well. And we had raised very clear questions. One of the central questions that we had also raised was with respect to Rule 3B, which had been struck down as being unconstitutional and illegal as well by the majority in the Constitution bench. To say that the rule that has been struck down does not apply to Sabarimala. So there are 2 consequences. One, a rule which does not apply to Sabarimala, Sabarimala is made to answer for it and defend it. And those institutions which rely on the rule did not get an opportunity to defend it in the first place. So there's a twin effect there. So these are the positions that I think we captured in the review. And which is precisely why, apart from the 7 questions identified for reference, the 14th November order also captures this issue with respect to Rule 3B, leaving it to a future review bench to decide whether it would want to rehear this particular issue in terms of applicability itself. So I do believe that legally we are squarely within the law, and we have raised the right issues. So it's not as if we were agitating some nuance where two different people are entitled to come to two different opinions. According to us, some material evidence which had been placed had not been considered, plus certain questions of law had been addressed with glaring error, if I may put it with a lot of respect, and or a patent error at least, which is the requirement for review. So the bench realized that over and above the errors in the judgment, so to speak, there are big picture issues which the court felt it important to address. So which is why if you look at, I think in para 5, there is one line which effectively, I think, says it's judgment under review. That phrase has been used. So according to me, the court has already taken a decision that the judgment of 28th of September 2018 warrants a review with respect to the treatment of that particular case, in addition to the questions of law which it had raised for the reference as well. So I certainly believe that the case for review is made out. That's my opinion. And I think that's a fair criticism from the standpoint of anyone who believes that a legal process must end somewhere. And I don't think that expectation is wrong at all. It's completely justified. But surely it can't be anybody's case that an existing remedy or an existing mechanism or an existing legal tool must not be used merely because it is not consistent with somebody's expectations of finality. If the remedy exists on paper, I, as a party, as an aggrieved party, as a stakeholder whose skin is in the game, who has a dog in this race, so to speak, have every right to invoke that particular mechanism, right? Going by that particular logic, I think we should then close all the doors for anyone who's convicted of rape and murder, okay? Or for that matter, who's convicted of waging war against India, and who decides to spend at least half a decade or more than that in the jails of this country without ever being meted out the punishment that was given to him and the sentence that was actually awarded to him, so to speak. So I'm clearly referring to the Yaqub Menon case as well. If the Supreme Court can open its doors at the midnight for someone who effectively stalled the sentencing, so to speak, of course he's entitled to his rights. It's a different question. Surely in this case it is important because had it been a commercial matter or had it been a question of money, it is compensable. So the damage is really not irreparable, so to speak. But if it's a question of faith, and if it's a question of sanctity, if it's a question of retaining, let's say, the belief that is associated with a certain place of worship, then any harm that is caused to it is almost irreparable and perhaps a textbook instance of irreparability. Okay? Therefore, I believe in such a situation, if there exists a mechanism, we have a right to invoke it. So which is why I think as part of the hearings before the 9-judge bench, one of the questions that was recently raised was whether it was legally permissible to refer a matter from a review, which I think the court held in our favor, so to speak, that of course it does. Because the question of reference is capable of arising at any stage in any proceeding. And I think it was Mr. Tushar Mehta, the learned SG, who pointed out to the court, Chapter 6, Rule 2 of the Supreme Court rules, which specifically uses the word any other proceeding or other proceeding. So given the breadth, the latitude of the language, surely there is a scope to argue, at the very least on the face of it, that reference is not necessarily to be ruled out merely because its potential arises in a review proceeding. There is no such limitation. I will not, of course, be speaking on the merits of the arguments at this particular stage because it's sub judice effectively. So I'm merely touching on these issues as superficially as possible. Frankly, I don't think, let's assume for a moment that there is a legitimate perception that perhaps the protest had a role to play. Then would it be a fair point to make that the countrywide outrage against the judgment of the Supreme Court originally in the 377 case also had a role to play as far as the subsequent outcome is concerned, right? So, to use the word protest would perhaps cast this entire issue in a slightly pejorative light. But at the end of the day, public discourse and judicial discourse cannot be in silos entirely, because at the end of the day, judges are part of the society and members of the judiciary are part of the society. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that the judiciary has to bow down to populism or popular will. Their allegiance and loyalty is entirely to the constitution and to the law. There is no doubting that at all. But those protests I don't think played a role. Those protests translated to very specific, sharp points raised in the review petition. Which is why, assume for a moment that the protests did play a significant role. I would do a simple exercise, which is keep the protests aside for a moment and ask yourself a simple question. Whether the questions which the reference bench has raised, don't they warrant an application of mind by a larger bench? If they do, and they have a bearing on the Sabarimala case itself, then independent of protests, there is merit as far as the reference itself is concerned. And therefore the review petitions must survive at the very least until the reference questions are answered, because the outcome could have a bearing on their fortunes or ultimate outcome, so to speak. So I'm going to say that, so what do we do when it comes to finding out the ratio in a judgment? We apply the Bamboo test, which is you try and remove a certain aspect, and if the judgment survives, then that is not the ratio, but if the judgment falls, then that is the ratio. So I would apply the same, let's say, approach here. Remove the aspect of protest from the entire calculus and ask yourself on a standalone basis whether a case is made out for reference or for review. If the answer is a yes, using the protest to color this particular proceeding or this outcome would be an extraneous consideration and perhaps an unwarranted consideration. I did certainly contribute to its ideation,
right.
And in terms of how it must look and what it must do,
right.
But this was a collective decision.
Right.
So some of the members who worked as part of the Sabarimala case had ultimately expressed an interest in going beyond these kind of issues. So at which stage, since I had already worked as, let's say, I had advised several such organizations in the past, I gave a broad template in terms of what is it that they could do. So my role, legally, factually, is that of a mentor to the legal team. So I'm not a trustee. So any decision that is taken by the trust is taken independently. It is run past me for legal advice and nothing beyond.
Right. Just generally speaking, there seems to be a notion that the Hindu way of living is under threat. What do you think this stems from? Right.
See, I don't want to say the Hindu way of living is under threat.
Okay.
I want to say that the native or indigenous impulse and its approach to life, its approach to even environment for that matter, women's rights and whatnot, or its own institutions, is fundamentally looked down upon and has been looked down upon, is an opinion that a lot of people share. And I don't need to beat around the bush on this particular issue. I too share this opinion because I believe that a certain establishment and a certain way of looking at these things for close to 60 to 70 years have played a significant role in their approach to these issues or these concerns. So there is a decent chance that this expression or this particular sentiment has found expression on the political front, it has found expression perhaps on the cultural front, and it has also found significant expression on the intellectual front. So for instance, if you read the writings of Mr. Arun Shourie, he clearly represents a certain point of view which was the voice of dissent and continues to be the voice of dissent compared to the narrative that is accepted in certain circles. Okay? The idea was to actually present this particular point of view in legal fora. And therefore, that's precisely why the Indie Collective was formed, and I think the charter of the Indie Collective is very, very clear about it. And in several interviews, I think the trustees have said this, and when I was asked my position on this, I have said the same thing as well. So I do believe that there is a certain grievance, and I don't think it's a perceived grievance, and I don't think it's a complex of victimhood. I do believe that there is more than an element of truth in this particular sentiment. And it's largely because I think Indic positions or indigenous positions have largely been viewed through the prism of the colonial lens, so to speak. Okay, so I do believe that treatment continues in a lot of places. So I tend to agree that it is the case, but I'm not going to necessarily play the victim. I don't think the solution lies in deriving a vicarious pleasure out of being a perpetual victim. Then you address the problem, work towards the solution, and learn to articulate it in a manner that people understand and can relate to. That I think is the way to go forward.
And what are some of the other legal issues that that will be taken up in the future by Indie Collective?
I think the Indie Collective on its website has identified 4 broad verticals or heads: education, civilization, environment, culture, and as part of national security. And temples fall within the realm of civilization. National security would mean issues such as illegal immigration, or let's say even for that matter, indigenization of the arms industry as much as possible. and therefore revamping the education curriculum, so to speak, right from the school to the college, to ensure that it caters to some of these industrial needs, and also revamping history curricula, but it's not revisionism. It is to basically say that if there is a certain point of view, allow the other point of view some space, and let the students decide which of these 2 points of view do they wish to put stock in, so to speak. So these are the broad heads, and I don't think the trust has been cagey about it. It's very, very open and candid in its engagement. I think even when Sri Hamid Ansari, the former vice president, was particularly uncharitable in his reference to the Indie Collective Trust, the trustees wrote an open letter clearly capturing what is their vision statement and mission statement and how do they wish to approach it. They've been extremely open about it, and I've had an opportunity to read it, and I had an opportunity to advise it on it as well, because I'm the legal mentor. So I do believe that these are the 4 verticals that they're interested in, and the central idea is to cultivate a strong research team which is in a position to churn out material which is verifiable, credible, reliable, and usable. As someone who has just spent about 10.5 years in the profession, I would want to be circumspect in my observations on that particular issue. But the question that I would ask myself is, what is it that people mean by independence of judiciary is something that I certainly want to understand better. And I'm not throwing this out as a rhetorical question. Because you see, we keep citing US judgments, and it is in the United States where judges are ultimately appointed by the person in power ultimately, and it's not even a party decision, it's an independent individual decision taken by one person who's elected, right? And you have a judicial reforms committee in the UK. And in India, an NJAC is struck down as being unconstitutional. So independence of the judiciary in the manner in which it has been interpreted in the 3 judges' judgments, so to speak, and how Section 124 has been interpreted, I fundamentally disagree with it, and I've always said this. Coupled with the existence of certain legislation such as Contempt of Courts Act, or at least in the manner in which they exist and to the extent to which they exist and the manner in which they are frequently invoked, perhaps even when a certain counsel ends up making a submission which is not to the liking of a certain member, those are the kind of instances which effectively warrant a certain question. If this is the extent to which this Contempt of Courts Act is capable of being invoked when the judiciary is currently this independent, so if going by the idealistic expectations of independence, if it becomes even more independent, what chance do we stand in terms of raising certain legitimate questions with respect to this organ of the country? Because at the end of the day, every democratic country, regardless of how constitutional or representative that particular institution is, everybody has a right to ask questions, right? So when you ask questions with respect to independence, you should also ask questions with respect to accountability, transparency, and answerability, right? I think all these questions must be addressed together. Looking at independence alone for independence sake, I don't think is perhaps the way forward. Second, I think I don't know if it would be fair to say that under a certain dispensation, we must always proceed with the assumption that the judiciary's independence stands undermined the moment somebody comes to power. Because anybody who's been in the profession is bound to tell you otherwise. Okay, but I'm not saying that if one has done it, the other should do it. Never, because ultimately we are looking at public benefit and we are looking at public good and what is right and what is wrong. I would want concrete and clear evidence of the let's say subversion of judicial independence before I buy a certain insinuation. So a spit and scoot approach with respect to this kind of a sensitive issue would perhaps be irresponsible. When somebody makes such a statement, they are raising questions with respect to the highest court of the country, the highest constitutional court of the country, a constitutional body. They might as well back it up. If they are not, then I think there's a problem. Because if going by the judgments which the court has delivered since 2014, there are any number of judgments which are castigating the government as the voice of dissent, and speaking truth to power seems to be the intent behind it, which is fair enough. So when the judgments are actually telling me that there is enough and more where the judgments reflect a clear pushback to the government on some of its initiatives, because the Aadhaar judgment was not completely in favor of the government, right? There were specific observations with respect to the manner in which it was passed as a money bill. Then there were specific observations with respect to greater requirements of privacy and whatnot. All of that was recognized, right? And it is under this government that the right to privacy stands recognized, right? Whether they have a role to play in it and can they take the credit for it is a different issue altogether. So I need more empirical evidence of some kind of data to actually buy this particular insinuation. Otherwise, everybody has an opinion on who is more independent under which government. That is a never-ending argument. And I think it's only a question of one's word over the other. Okay, I don't think that counts for too much. What is the evidence that is being presented? I don't think people would have the guts to actually present any evidence, because that would mean spelling things with clarity and with specificity, which nobody would want to do when it comes to this kind of an issue. If I'm presented with that kind of a data, that kind of an evidence, I'll have a better, let's say, grounding to respond or at least agree or concede. So far, I don't see the evidence for it.
On that note, we'll end.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon.